Hello there, and welcome to the Sleep Science Galaxy channel. Right now, allow yourself to pause for just a moment. There is no need to understand anything. No need to rush. Simply be present. Perhaps you are lying in a quiet, dark room. Perhaps the outside world has slowed down, and all that remains is the steady rhythm of your breath, flowing gently from one moment to the next. Tonight, we will step together into a journey that reaches very far, yet remains completely safe. This is not a story meant to frighten you. There is no danger here, only the stillness of the universe and questions vast enough that you do not need to answer them. We will speak about the singularity, the place where the universe seems to end, not to seek solutions, but to rest beside the question itself. Let your mind soften, let your heartbeat slow, and allow this story to carry you gently, deeper, slower, and more peacefully. Gentle curiosity. There is a very strange question that human beings only dare to ask when everything around them has become quiet enough. Not in the noisy hours of daytime, not when the mind is busy with tasks and obligations, but most often at night, when the lights soften, when breathing slows, when we lie still and allow thoughts to drift freely. This question does not rush us. It does not demand an immediate answer. It appears very softly, like a small wave touching the shore of consciousness. Where is the boundary of everything? Not the border of a country, not a line on a map, but the boundary of existence itself. The boundary where everything familiar begins to feel strange. The boundary where the things we once believed were solid suddenly feel fragile. When this question arises, we usually do not panic. On the contrary, it carries a deeply human feeling: curiosity, gentleness, and a faint, unnamed sense of wistfulness. Imagine yourself standing by the sea in the late afternoon. The sun is low, the wind has softened, and the waves roll in steadily, like the earth's vast, rhythmic breath. You know clearly that you are standing on solid ground. You know what water is, what waves are, how the tides work. Everything feels familiar. But when you look far out, where the surface of the sea seems to merge with the sky, there is a very thin, very distant line that your eyes cannot cross. The horizon. You know it is not a wall. You know nothing truly stops there. And yet, you also know you cannot see beyond it. Not because the sea forbids you, but because of the limits of your eyes, of the place where you're standing. That feeling, the feeling of standing before a boundary that does not threaten you, yet cannot be crossed, is exactly the feeling the universe gives us when we begin to ask about its end. The universe does not build a fence. It does not say, "Do not go further." It simply opens itself up to a certain point and then quietly stops, as if smiling gently and saying, "This is far enough. The rest belongs to silence." In science, humans give this boundary a name that sounds sharp and cold: singularity. But if we remove the technical shell, if we stop seeing it as a term and instead experience it inwardly, singularity is no different from the horizon of understanding. It is not necessarily the place where the universe ends in a physical sense. It is the place where our language begins to lose its breath, where formulas, so confident when describing stars, planets, light, and time, suddenly grow uncertain. Numbers stretch into infinity. Familiar concepts lose their shape, and instead of answering, science becomes silent. That silence is not a failure. It is a rare form of honesty. Like a storyteller who pauses mid-sentence, not because there are no words left, but because the story has reached something that cannot be told with words. Singularity, in its deepest sense, is the moment when knowledge acknowledges its own limits. And strangely, when we understand this, we do not feel disappointed. We feel lighter. Because for most of our lives, we are drawn into the need to understand, to grasp, to explain. We grow accustomed to the safety that answers provide. But the universe does not operate according to that psychological need. It does not exist to reassure us. It exists simply as it is. And sometimes, that pure existence stretches beyond every framework the human mind can build. When we see singularity as a boundary of knowledge rather than a frightening abyss, we begin to sense its quiet, unusual beauty. It is the beauty of stopping, like walking a very long distance along familiar paths, and then arriving at a place where there is no trail anymore, no signs, no directions, only open space and a deep stillness. You do not need to go any further. Standing there is already enough. The curiosity this part of the story awakens is not the kind that tightens the mind. It does not force you to imagine violent images or push you beyond your limits. It is like sitting by a window at night, looking at the sky and wondering, what lies beyond those stars? That question does not keep you awake. Instead, it makes you feel smaller. And within that smallness, there is a strangely comforting sense of safety. Because when we become smaller before the universe, the burden of controlling everything becomes smaller too. Singularity, when told in a gentle voice, is no longer a place where everything collapses. It becomes a place where the mind's effort is allowed to rest. A place where we do not need more data, do not need more knowledge. We only need to be present with the question, like sitting beside a small fire, not to warm ourselves, but simply to watch the flame burn. Perhaps that is why the image of the shoreline fits so well. The sea never asks you to understand it. It does not explain fluid dynamics before letting the waves arrive. It does not require you to know the names of every current. You only need to stand there, to listen, to feel. And in that moment, even if you never go beyond the horizon, you still feel as though you have touched something real. The universe is the same. Singularity is not a door slammed shut in front of humanity. It is more like a veil of mist. You know there is something beyond it, and you also know you do not need to step through. Knowing is enough. Feeling is enough. Resting beside the question is already a complete experience. And when the story is told this way, the mind is not stretched tight. It is guided gently, like a river flowing into still water. Curiosity does not turn into anxiety. It becomes openness, a readiness to listen, a sense that not every mystery must be solved to be meaningful. Some questions exist not to be answered, but to accompany us. Singularity, in its deepest layer, is such a question. It reminds us that knowledge has boundaries, and that does not weaken knowledge. It makes it more humane. When science knows how to stop, humans are allowed to breathe, and in that breath, as you lie still, as the outside world slowly fades, the question of the universe's boundary is no longer a challenge. It becomes a lullaby, a whisper that says, you do not need to reach the end in order to be within the universe. You have been inside it all along, from the very beginning. Defining singularity. When we grow accustomed to standing before the horizon of knowledge, when the question of where everything ends no longer makes us restless, but simply lingers like a thin veil of mist, something natural begins to happen. Not a step forward, but a step inward. We stop asking, how much farther does it go? And begin to ask a subtler, slower question, What lies there, exactly where our understanding comes to rest? At that moment, science whispers a name, not in a declarative voice, but in one that is careful, almost hesitant. Singularity, a word that sounds sharp, heavy, but if we move past our first impression, if we resist attaching it too quickly to extreme images, singularity is neither a frightening mass nor a dark point that devours everything. It is a concept born from science's honesty when science looks directly at its own limits. Humans often imagine singularity as a tiny dot in space, a specific location that could be marked, as if we could point and say, "It's right there." But that image, though convenient, is far too narrow. Singularity does not behave like an ordinary place. It is not like a planet, not like a star, not even like an object in the familiar sense. It is closer to a situation than a location, a situation in which the concepts we rely on to understand the universe suddenly lose their usefulness. Normally, when we perceive the world, we lean on very basic relationships. Space gives us distance. Time gives us sequence. Mass, energy, motion, all of them follow consistent rules, enough for us to believe that the universe is, if not fully understandable, then at least partially so. But singularity appears as a point where those relationships can no longer hold their shape. Space can no longer be measured. Time no longer flows in familiar ways. Equations that were once precise suddenly return infinite values, as if mathematics itself were saying, "I was not made to go this far." And this is crucial. This is not the collapse of reality. It is the collapse of description. Reality remains there, in some form, but human language can no longer keep up. Singularity does not break the universe. It breaks the conceptual framework we use to speak about the universe. When we understand this, we begin to see it differently, with less fear and with more respect. There are two places in the grand story of the universe where this concept appears most clearly. Two places that seem very far apart, yet reflect one another like two sides of the same mirror. One lies very close to the beginning. The other lies near an apparent end. One is the moment the universe begins to unfold. The other is the moment the universe closes in upon itself within a black hole, when science traces the history of the universe backward into the past, through billions of years of expansion, through young galaxies, through dense, blazing plasma. It eventually reaches a threshold where all familiar descriptions lose their meaning, not because there is nothing there, but because everything is compressed beyond distinction. Space is no longer a wide stage for events to occur. Time is no longer a flow we can follow. Everything we know merges into a single state, without dimension, without form, without before or after. This is where science places the name singularity for the moment of the universe's birth. What is striking, however, is that science does not describe this moment as an explosion within space. There is no center of detonation, no fragments flying outward into a pre-existing void. Space and time are not the backdrop of that event. They are its result. Singularity here is not an object inside the universe. It is the state from which the universe itself, along with space and time, begins to have meaning. On the other side of the story, when a massive star reaches the end of its life, when every source of support is exhausted, when matter can no longer maintain balance, it begins to collapse under its own gravity. Not chaotically, but in an orderly, inevitable way. Layer presses upon layer, all empty space erased, until there is no longer any way to describe the state using ordinary concepts. Once again, space and time refuse to behave as expected. Once again, equations lead us to a point they cannot pass. And once again, the name singularity is used, not to explain, but to mark the stopping point of understanding. These two contexts, one at the dawn of everything, one at the heart of collapse, show that singularity is not an isolated phenomenon. It is a signal that when the universe is pushed to its extremes, the intellectual tools of humanity must be gently set down. Not because they are useless, but because they have fulfilled their purpose. Within a meditative journey, this carries a very different meaning. Singularity ceases to be a cold term from theoretical physics. It becomes a subtle symbol of humility. It reminds us that there are regions of reality that do not need to be conquered in order to be meaningful. That some things do not need to be fully understood in order to be deeply contemplated. When this story is told slowly, in a low voice, with silence allowed to exist between ideas, singularity gradually loses its sharp edges. It becomes a deep pause in the music of the universe. No sound, yet it is precisely this absence that gives the entire composition its depth. For the listener, especially one preparing to drift into sleep, this is essential. The mind is not forced to process numbers, not pushed into overly abstract models. Instead, it is guided to understand intuitively that there are points in the universe where the story pauses, not because it ends, but because it has reached the most delicate point possible. Singularity, in this sense, is not where the universe ends. It is where the human way of telling the story ends. And right there, a different kind of listening begins. Not listening through analysis, but through feeling. Not through effort, but through release. As you lie still, as the lights are off, as your breathing becomes steady, this idea has a gentle effect. It allows the mind to stop chasing the need to understand everything. It whispers that some questions are not meant to be answered, but to be kept company with. Singularity is one of those questions, a question that rests at the boundary between science and stillness, between knowledge and acceptance, between effort and rest. And from that foundation, from this soft yet honest understanding, the journey can continue, not by pushing deeper into darkness, but by allowing darkness to exist without needing to be driven away. Because sometimes, in the universe as in the human mind, the most profound truths are not found in what is illuminated, but in what is honored through silence. The collapse of a star and the birth of a black hole. When we have accepted that there are places in the universe where human language must come to a halt, when the idea of singularity is no longer a cold point in a textbook, but becomes a deep pause within understanding, the story naturally asks for something more tangible to hold on to. The human mind, even when ready to loosen its grip on concepts, still needs a bridge. And that bridge arrives through the stars. Think of a star, not as a distant point of light in the sky, but as a living presence. For millions, even billions of years, it exists through a delicate balance. Deep in its core, nuclear reactions unfold without rest, releasing immense energy. That energy creates an outward pressure, pushing against gravity, which is always trying to pull everything inward toward the center. This tension, this quiet struggle, is what allows the star to remain stable, to shine, to exist like a steady heartbeat in the cold vastness of space. But no heartbeat lasts forever. Fuel is not infinite. Gradually, so slowly that no short-lived being could ever sense it, the energy in the star's core begins to run out. The reactions that once burned so fiercely weaken. The outward pressure fades. And when that happens, gravity, never gone only patiently waiting, begins to take the lead. There is no haste in this moment. No drama like the ones humans often imagine, only a quiet inevitability. When nothing remains to hold it up, the star begins to turn back upon itself. Matter once kept at safe distances now slips inward, layer by layer, as if space itself were shrinking. Empty gaps disappear. Familiar structures are compressed. Here, gravity is no longer the gentle force that keeps you grounded on Earth. It becomes the central presence, without emotion, without intention, doing the only thing it has ever done, pulling everything as close together as possible. Under ordinary conditions, other forces, electromagnetism, pressure, motion, keep the world from collapsing. But when a sufficiently massive star loses its final source of energy, gravity no longer has a rival. If we could witness this scene, it would not resemble a chaotic explosion. It would look like a profound inward folding, a contraction taken to the extreme. Everything is pressed toward the center, where density rises beyond anything we normally experience. Space, once familiar and expansive, begins to behave differently. It is no longer a passive stage for events. It becomes an active participant in the collapse itself. And then, a very special moment appears. Not a visible line, not a glowing wall, but an invisible boundary. Once matter, light, or any signal crosses this boundary, there is no path back. Not because something blocks the way, but because the very structure of space and time has been bent so deeply that every direction leads inward. Forward and backward lose their distinction. All paths converge toward a single point. This is where the abstract idea of singularity finds its physical body. No longer just a vague notion of the limits of knowledge, but a phenomenon inferred from the motion of stars, from the bending of light, from faint signals echoing from afar. Humans do not see the center itself, but they sense its presence through what happens around it. Stars orbit faster than can be otherwise explained. Streams of matter stretch and heat until they glow in energies invisible to the naked eye. What is strange is that, despite being one of the most violent processes in the universe, its story carries a deep stillness. There is no malice, no catastrophe in a moral sense, only a phase transition of reality, as a star moves from a state of balance into one where balance is no longer possible. Gravity does not attack. It simply does the one thing it knows how to do, in conditions where all other forces have fallen silent. When told within a meditative space, this story does not emphasize destruction. It is seen as a return. Matter, once spread across space, now gathers back to its deepest point, an absolute concentration, a heavy but orderly silence, like a human mind that stops chasing countless thoughts and settles into a single, still center. At that invisible boundary, time itself begins to behave differently. To a distant observer, everything appears to slow down. Signals stretch, redden, weaken, as if the universe were whispering instead of speaking aloud. But for anything falling inward, there is no special moment felt. No bell rings, no warning appears. There is only an irreversible continuation. And this is what makes the story both scientific and deeply contemplative. It reminds us that there are points in reality where the idea of returning no longer applies, not because it is forbidden, but because the structure of everything has changed. This is not a punishment. It is simply another state of existence. When the mind has been guided from abstract ideas about the limits of knowledge to the concrete image of a collapsing star, the listener no longer feels suspended. They can imagine, not through technical detail, but through sensation, the sensation of an irresistible pull, the sensation of a boundary that does not need to be feared, the sensation that the universe, even at its most extreme moments, still operates according to a deeper order. And within that order lies a very gentle lesson. Not every ending is a breakdown. Sometimes it is a transformation into another form of being, where old rules no longer apply. The star does not die in the way humans often mean. It completes a long journey and enters a state where light is no longer its primary expression. As the listener lies still, as their breathing aligns with the slow rhythm of the narration, the image of this collapse does not create tension. It carries a deep, resonant feeling, like a sustained bass note in the music of the universe. It helps the mind drift away from small, daily worries and touch broader laws, where nothing happens for or against anyone, but simply because that is how the universe maintains its own coherence. From here, the story now has form. From a concept of limits, we have stepped into a scene that can be felt. Gravity is no longer a formula. It is a deep, slow, unceasing current. And where that current reaches its extreme, a boundary appears, not to threaten, but to remind us that some paths move in only one direction. In accepting this, there is a strange peace, a peace that comes not from resisting what cannot be changed, but from quietly witnessing it unfold, just as the universe has always done for a very long time. A safe distance, psychological reassurance. After the mind has followed the story of a star completing its long journey, after the images of a deep gravitational pull and an irreversible boundary have become clear enough to be felt, there is something very important that needs to be placed gently into position. Not to deny what has just been heard, but to help it settle into the right place within the listener's emotional landscape. Because when people touch the universe's most extreme images, the mind's natural reflex is often to tighten, as if an invisible threat were approaching. And it is precisely here that the story must shift, very slowly, very softly, to remind you, you are at a safe distance. Return to the feeling of your body in this moment. You are lying down. Your weight is supported. Your breathing is steady. There is no sudden movement. No force is pulling you beyond the familiar gravity that gently holds you against the earth. What you have just heard is not a warning. It is a picture viewed from very far away. So far away that between you and it lie millions, even billions of light years of empty, silent, cold, and peaceful space. Those deep phenomena are not happening here. They are not hiding just above the sky over your head. They are not moving toward Earth. They have no intention and no ability to cross those immense distances and reach into everyday human life. The universe is so vast that even its most violent events unfold in near total isolation. When people first hear about regions of space where light cannot escape, imagination often does its work too well. It paints images of swallowing, tearing, and crushing. But that imagination is built from very small human experiences in a very different world. In reality, those deep regions exist like distant islands in the cosmic ocean. They do not wander. They do not hunt. They simply are, quietly, like deep folds in space-time itself. There is an important difference between understanding something and being pulled into it. This story does not invite you to move closer. It invites you to stay where you are, to remain in the position of an observer. From there is no sudden motion, no risk, only distance. And it is that distance which creates safety. Science, in its calm clarity, has confirmed this again and again. These extreme regions are contained by the very structure of space and time. Everything that happens within them is held there, not like a violent prison, but as a natural consequence of cosmic geometry. What goes in does not spread outward. There are no dangerous waves, no immediate influence, no return path that could disturb the calmer regions of space. When this is understood, the mind can relax. Because the greatest threat usually does not come from the phenomenon itself, but from the way we imagine it. When images are placed correctly, when context is widened enough, fear dissolves on its own. It does not need to be forced away. It simply no longer has a reason to remain. Imagine watching a powerful storm at sea from very far away through a thick window. You see the movement, the strength, but you are not struck by the wind, not hit by the waves. Distance does not make the storm smaller, but it makes your experience of it safe. The universe offers us the same kind of distance, a perfect distance for observing without being swept along. In a relaxed state, this is especially important. The listener does not need to stay alert. There is no need to build any psychological defenses. The story does not lead them to the edge of danger. It keeps them in a stable place, where every image is framed within the safety of contemplation. These deep phenomena are not told to trigger adrenaline, but to expand the sense of vastness, and through that expansion, to make personal worries feel smaller. There is a quiet, beautiful paradox here. When we understand that the strongest forces in the universe are contained in regions very far away, we begin to feel more at ease with our own position. Earth, with all its fragility, exists in a remarkably gentle neighborhood of space. Sunlight arrives regularly. Orbits are stable. No violent upheavals are lurking nearby. The ordinary rhythm of daily life, so often overlooked, reveals itself as something deeply precious. In this context, singularity is no longer something threatening from afar. It is a concept held firmly within its own domain. It does not spill outward. It does not spread. It does not disrupt the order of other regions of space. It is like a deep point of silence, where all motion turns inward, not outward. And that very fact creates a clear sense of safety. What happens there, stays there. When the listener allows themselves to trust this, breathing naturally slows, shoulders soften, the jaw releases, the mind stops scanning. In its place arises a feeling of being held within the vast order of the universe. An order not perfect by human standards, but stable enough for life to exist, for consciousness to ask questions, and for stories like this to be told in peace. There is something subtle in the way science approaches extreme phenomena. It does not promise absolute safety in every circumstance, but it offers context. And context, when understood correctly, is the most powerful reassurance of all. Fear is often born when a phenomenon is torn away from the whole. When it is placed back into the larger picture, it finds its proper position. And that position is usually very far from the center of human life. In a journey designed to guide the listener toward sleep, this is the moment for the story to soften. No more technical detail is needed. No more intense imagery. Only a gentle emphasis. You are here, and here is safe. What has been described belongs to a universe so vast that its extremes cannot reach you. This sense of safety does not come from denying reality, but from understanding scale. When scale is expanded enough, imagined threats shrink into very small, very distant points. And within that vast space, a person can lie down, listen, and allow the mind to rest without vigilance. On a deeper level, this carries a beautiful psychological meaning. It teaches us that not everything powerful must be avoided. Some things are so powerful that they contain themselves. Some extremes do not spread outward, but fold inward. And when we understand that, we learn how the mind can do the same. Gathering anxieties, holding them at a distance, not allowing them to flood the space meant for rest. And as the story settles into this rhythm, the listener may feel a gentle trust arise. Trust in the universe. Trust in distance. Trust in not needing to stay alert for what is far away. Trust that right now, the only thing to do is to keep breathing, keep listening, and allow oneself to drift deeper into rest. From that place of safety, the journey can continue, not by moving closer to the dark regions, but by viewing them from afar, with calm. Because once distance has been established, once fear has been set down, the universe no longer feels threatening. It becomes a vast, quiet space, wide enough to hold both the unknowable and the peaceful sleep of a very small human being lying still within it. Black holes and the structure of the universe. When the sense of safety has been placed like solid ground beneath the mind, when the mind no longer recoils from the universe's most extreme images, something very natural begins to happen. We start to look back at what we have heard with a different gaze, no longer cautious, but curious in a softened way. And within that gentleness, an important realization slowly, steadily emerges. Those deep phenomena are not rare mistakes of the universe. They are not random cracks in an otherwise orderly system. On the contrary, they appear in very central, highly organized positions, as if the universe placed them there from the very beginning. Imagine looking at a galaxy from very far away, not as a faint smear of light in the night sky, but as a vast structure slowly rotating through space. Hundreds of billions of stars, each one a story of its own, move together along complex yet harmonious paths. At first glance, everything seems to revolve around an emptiness, a dark region that emits no light, draws no attention, makes no display. And yet, it is precisely this darkness toward which all motion is directed. For a long time, humans regarded this dark center with suspicion. A core that does not shine, cannot be seen, cannot be touched. This felt more like a flaw than a foundation. But science, with its patience, learned to observe not with eyes alone, but through motion. And from those motions, a very different picture gradually emerged. The stars near the galactic center do not move randomly. They orbit rapidly, extremely rapidly, along paths that can exist only if an immense mass is anchoring everything in place. Something that does not emit light, yet is heavy enough to bend space itself, stable enough to sustain the order of an entire, sprawling star system. Not an accident, not an anomaly, but an invisible pillar. At the center of our own galaxy, the same is true. There is no blazing beacon, no dramatic signal, only a region of space around which everything moves with absolute coherence. Not out of fear, but because the structure of reality there requires it. That dark region does not swallow the galaxy. It holds the galaxy. It allows orbits to exist, allows spiral arms to keep their shape across billions of years. With this realization, the way we see the universe's deepest regions begins to change. They no longer look like wounds. They look like keystones, points where the universe anchors itself so that it does not come apart. In a cosmos where everything is expanding, drifting outward, these regions of extreme concentration act like silent anchors, keeping large-scale structures from being torn apart. From this perspective, The idea that these dark regions are errors of the universe no longer makes sense. An error disrupts order. Here, it is precisely their presence that allows order on vast scales to persist. Galaxies do not collapse because they have heavy centers. They revolve around them, like a slow, steady dance unfolding across spans of time the human mind can scarcely imagine. There is a quiet beauty in this arrangement. It is not loud. It does not need to be seen to be effective. It works silently, continuously, without seeking recognition. Much like the forces in human life that we only notice when they are gone. The things that keep us grounded, that keep us stable, are rarely the most dazzling ones. In a meditative context, this idea carries deep comfort. It allows the listener to look at the darker regions within themselves through a different lens. Not everything dark is broken. Not everything that cannot be named needs to be fixed. There are depths within the mind, like the depths of the universe, that are not meant to shine, but to hold structure. When this story is told in a slow voice, with a steady rhythm, it does not overwhelm the listener. It gently introduces a subtle reversal in perception, that the universe is built not only from bright stars, but also from dark centers, and that darkness is not the absence of order, but another form of order, deeper, quieter, less performative. The widespread presence of these invisible centers across countless galaxies tells us something important. This is not an exception. It is part of the universe's architecture, as if, in organizing itself, the cosmos consistently requires such anchor points. Not to pull everything into destruction, but to allow large structures to remain stable over immense stretches of time. When the listener allows this understanding to settle in, the mind relaxes in a new way. Not only because it feels safe, but because it begins to see that depth does not automatically mean danger. Depth can be foundation. And when a foundation is recognized for what it is, fear naturally transforms into respect. There is a quiet humility in how science approaches these centers. It does not assign moral meaning to them. It does not call them good or evil. It simply acknowledges their role in the larger picture. And that neutrality opens a wide emotional space for the listener, a space where one can observe without judgment, understand without needing control. Within the slow rhythm of a sleep-guiding journey, this creates a profound sense of steadiness. The listener no longer feels as though they are standing at the edge of an abyss, but as if they are looking at a pillar within a vast structure. There is no need to touch it. No need to move closer. Simply knowing that it is there is enough, because its presence allows everything else to remain stable. From here, the universe no longer appears as a chaotic place, punctuated by dangerous anomalies. It becomes a refined structure, where both light and darkness have their roles. And when darkness is placed in its proper position, it ceases to be frightening. It becomes necessary. In this quiet moment, while the listener lies still and lets the story pass, this understanding may flow into deeper layers of personal experience. That within each person, too, there are wordless centers, unlit spaces of silence, and that these are precisely what keep the self from fragmenting amid the constant expansion of thoughts and emotions. Seen this way, the universe is not something that needs fixing. It is an architecture operating according to its own nature. And its dark centers, its invisible pillars, are not design flaws. They are part of the deepest design. When this is understood, not only does the universe become easier to accept, but the darker spaces within us are also allowed to exist without justification. And from that acceptance, a very deep peace begins to form. Not the peace of everything being brightly illuminated, but the peace of knowing that even within darkness, there is order. There is structure. There is a quiet reason for everything to be exactly where it is. The singularity of time, the Big Bang. When our gaze has grown accustomed to the idea that dark regions are not flaws, when the notion of invisible pillars has settled into the mind as a quiet, stable truth, the story naturally wishes to go further still. Not farther through space, but backward along another dimension, the dimension of time. For if those deep centers hold galaxies steady in the present, there remains another silent question waiting to be touched. Where did everything begin? Here, the voice of the story must slow by another measure. Because when we speak of origins, we are no longer speaking of objects orbiting one another, no longer speaking of motions that can be observed. We begin to step into a region where ordinary intuition is no longer sufficient. And as with every encounter with a limit, the first thing required is not an effort to understand, but a willingness to loosen old habits of thought. Humans have a very natural reflex. When we hear of a beginning, we immediately ask, what came before? Before today was yesterday. Before adulthood was childhood. All lived experience teaches us that time is a flowing stream with past, present, and future. But when the story reaches the birth of the universe, that reflex begins to falter. Not because the question is wrong, but because it is being asked in a place where the very concept of before has not yet come into existence. Here, science does not answer with a spectacular image. It answers with a silence full of meaning. For if time is part of the universe, if it is not a pre-existing stage but a component born together with space and energy, then asking what happened before time existed becomes like asking where north of the North Pole lies. The question is grammatically correct, but it slips outside the structure of reality itself. The moment of origin, therefore, is not like an explosion occurring within an already existing emptiness. It is not an event that took place at a marked point on an infinitely extended timeline. It is the point at which that very timeline begins to have meaning. What came before was not darkness, not nothingness, and not something waiting. There simply was no before. For a mind accustomed to sequence, this can feel disorienting. But if the story is allowed to move slowly, if we do not rush to replace it with new images, the disorientation gradually softens. It transforms into a very unusual feeling. The sense that there are places in reality where questions do not need answers, because the questions themselves dissolve upon contact. Here, the concept of singularity is no longer tied to gravity or collapse, but to emergence. Not the birth of an object, but the birth of the very framework within which all later objects can exist. Time, in this view, is not an eternal river that we happen to step into. It is a phenomenon with an age. It has a first moment. And that moment does not lie within time, because it is where time itself is born. When told in a meditative tone, this idea is not shocking. It does not demand that the listener imagine the unimaginable. It simply offers a gentle shift in perspective. That perhaps, instead of standing outside and watching time flow, we are living inside a structure that opened from a point without before or after. In this context, the question, what was before, no longer frustrates us when it lacks an answer. It becomes like a wave touching a rocky shore, and then dissolving. It leaves no sense of loss behind, only a deep quiet. Because when a question loses its meaning, the mind is freed from the need to cling. There's a very subtle philosophical dimension here. If time has a beginning, if it is not an absolute foundation, but a part of reality itself, then human experience is cast in a different light. Worries about the past and anxieties about the future, which rest on the feeling that time is infinite and must be chased, suddenly grow lighter. We begin to see that we are not thrown into an endless current, but living within an opening that has limits, shape, and structure. As the listener lies still and allows these ideas to sink in, not through logic, but through feeling, a very deep relaxation can arise. Because if even time itself has a beginning, then our inability to control it is no longer a personal failure. It is a natural consequence of living inside something far larger than individual will. The singularity of time in this story is not a wall that blocks understanding. It is an invitation to humility, an invitation to recognize that there are layers of reality where asking questions no longer yields more information, but yields silence. And that silence, when allowed to exist, is not empty. It is full of the possibility of rest, full of the sense that not everything needs to be arranged into linear order to have meaning, full of the realization that the very fact that time has a beginning makes each present moment precious, not because it leads somewhere, but because it is. At a deeper level, this opens a beautiful parallel between the universe and the meditative experience. In meditation, there are moments when the mind no longer clings to past or future. No more before and after, only presence. And in those moments, people often say that time seems to dissolve, not disappearing, but losing its power to govern. Seen through this lens, the origin of the universe is no longer a distant event to be debated. It becomes a profound mirror, reflecting the human capacity to touch states where questions do not need to be solved, only released. In a sleep-guiding journey, this is a crucial transition. The listener is not led farther into space, but inward, into a very still region of awareness, a region where time is not erased, but gently set aside, where the rhythm of the narration slows so much that even the silences between sentences become part of the story. And in that stillness, the idea that time emerged from a point of space-time without time no longer feels difficult to accept. It becomes a soft image, like a perfectly calm lake before the first ripple appears. There is no before the lake. There is only the lake, and then the ripple. When the listener allows themselves to drift within that image, without grasping, without trying to understand, a deep sense of peace can spread. Because if the universe itself once began from a point without time, then letting go of time for a while in order to fall asleep no longer feels strange. It feels like a very gentle, very natural return to a state the universe itself once knew, from the very first moment of its own existence. The limits of knowledge. Theory breakdown. When we have reached the moment in which time gives birth to itself, when the idea of before and after has softened and dissolved like morning mist, another door quietly opens. Not a door leading to more answers, but one that leads to the limits of answering itself. Here, the story no longer revolves around the outer universe, but gently turns back to look at the very tool humans use to understand the universe: knowledge. For much of its history, science has been a journey of confidence. Each step forward seemed to illuminate another region, turning what was once mysterious into something describable, predictable. We learn that space can curve, that time can stretch, that light can be bent by mass. Elegant equations told us the stories of planets, stars, and even the deepest dark regions. For a long time, it felt as though if we simply kept going, writing more, solving more, everything would eventually be revealed. But as the story approaches its most extreme points, that rhythm begins to change. Equations that were once reliable start to feel unfamiliar. They no longer answer with known values, but with quantities that escape every scale. Certain terms swell toward infinity, not because reality itself is truly infinite in the way intuition imagines, but because the mathematical language we are using is no longer refined enough to contain what it is trying to describe. Here, science does not collapse in a tragic sense. It is not denied. It is not overturned. It simply stops, like a well-paved road that suddenly ends at the edge of a cliff. Not because the road was wrong, but because it was built for a different kind of terrain. And at that edge, if we keep running at the same speed, the only result is losing balance. This moment, when seen through a hurried mind, can feel uncomfortable. Humans are not used to their most powerful tools falling silent. We are taught that knowledge exists to conquer, to push beyond limits. But in this space, pushing forward is no longer the wisest option. What is needed instead is to stop, and to observe the stopping itself. The infinite values that appear in equations are not declarations that reality is infinite in the intuitive sense. They are more like signs telling us that the map we are using has reached the end of its usefulness. Not because the world ends there, but because a different map is required. And that other map, at least for now, is still incomplete. And so, amid humanity's greatest intellectual efforts, a pause appears. A pause that is rare in the history of science. It is not immediately filled by a new theory, not resolved by more data. It exists as a quiet region where provisional answers give way to an honest acknowledgement. We do not yet know. For a meditation guide, this is an extraordinarily precious moment. Because in everyday life, people rarely allow themselves not to know. Not knowing is often associated with weakness, with failure. But here, not knowing takes on a different quality. It becomes an open space, unfilled by hurried assumptions. When we say that knowledge stops, it does not mean the journey ends. It means the journey changes pace, from running to walking, from walking to standing still. And in that stillness, another form of understanding begins to emerge. Not understanding through concepts, but through humility. There is a subtle relief in realizing that even the greatest theories have boundaries. Relief because it frees us from the pressure to grasp everything. If the very structure of the universe contains regions that current knowledge cannot penetrate, then the existence of blind spots in an individual mind is no longer something to be blamed. This pause in understanding is not empty. It is like the silence between two musical notes, where the music itself finds room to breathe. Without those silences, a melody would become a relentless stream of sound, losing its depth. In the same way, without points of rest, knowledge would turn into a self-asserting machine, rigid, dry, and disconnected from lived experience. In a relaxed state, as the listener allows this story to sink in, a deep resonance may arise. Because within each person's life, there are also points where reason stops, questions without clear answers, situations that cannot be fully explained. Rather than seeing these as personal failures, we can begin to see them as small singularities of experience. places where familiar tools no longer work. And another way of being is quietly invited. Intellectual humility, in this context, is not a rejection of science. On the contrary, it is the highest expression of the scientific spirit. True science does not claim to know everything. It knows precisely how far it knows and where it must stop. It has the courage to say, "Here, we need to listen more, wait longer, and perhaps learn an entirely new language." As you lie still and let your breathing slow, this idea can become a very gentle support. You do not need to force your mind to understand what lies beyond its current reach. You only need to recognize that not understanding is not falling into darkness, but standing at the edge of an unlit region. And standing there, in stillness, is already a form of understanding. In this space, knowledge does not disappear. It rests. And in that rest, it opens the possibility for deeper, softer, more humane forms of knowing. Just as the universe does not rush to reveal all its secrets, the mind does not need to rush to fill every gap. The pause of understanding, when accepted, becomes a refuge, a place where the intellect no longer strains, no longer needs to prove itself. It simply remains present, much like the universe itself remains present at the edge of the theories that describe it. And within that resonance, the listener may feel a very deep safety. The safety of not knowing, the safety of releasing answers, and the safety of gently drifting into sleep, carrying the trust that not everything must be understood in order to be at peace. Traces of the unseen, when we have accepted that there are places where knowledge comes to rest, that the silence of theory is not a failure, but a natural boundary, something very interesting happens. That silence is not an absolute void. It does not erase all traces. Even when we cannot look directly into the heart of darkness, we discover that this darkness is not invisible in an absolute sense. It leaves footprints. And it is through these footprints that humanity continues forward, not by intrusion, but by careful observation. In everyday life, we are accustomed to understanding things through sight. If we see it, we believe it. If we do not, we doubt. But the universe, especially its most extreme regions, teaches us a different lesson. There are things that never appear directly, yet their presence is clearer than any image. Like the wind, which has no shape, yet the bending of trees is undeniable proof. The deep, dark regions of space are the same. We do not see their cores. No ray of light carries an image of those places back to us. But around them, everything moves differently. Stars no longer follow the gentle, familiar paths we expect. They race faster, curve more sharply, as if dancing around an invisible partner of overwhelming weight. From afar, the scene is not violent at all. It is beautiful, a rhythmic, precise rotation that tells the observer there must be something extraordinarily powerful keeping the tempo of this dance. There is great subtlety in how science approaches such phenomena. Instead of trying to look where seeing is impossible, humans step back. They observe what is affected. Like someone standing at the edge of a lake, unable to see the current beneath the surface, yet knowing it is there from the way leaves drift across the water. It is not only the motion of stars that tells this story. The space surrounding these dark regions also releases signals unlike any others. Powerful streams of energy, outside the range of light human eyes can perceive, resonate like whispers at another frequency. They do not illuminate the night sky in familiar ways, but delicate instruments detect them, as one might listen to the heartbeat of a vast, living being. These signals do not arise from the dark region itself. but from the matter around it. From clouds of gas stretched and heated until they glow in forms the human eye will never see. They are like flames flaring at the edge of a deep pit, telling us the pit is there even though we cannot see its bottom. And then there are streams of matter launched outward, straight and far to a nearly unimaginable extent. They shoot out from the centers of galaxies, stretching across thousands of light years like colossal arrows piercing the dark. No one sees where they begin, but their direction, shape, and power speak clearly. They could not have been born in an ordinary environment. Only a source of energy, unimaginably deep and concentrated, could create structures like these. When these images are told in a slow, gentle voice, they lose any sense of threat. Instead, they evoke a very special feeling, the sense that even in the deepest darkness, the universe is still communicating with us, not by opening every door, but by leaving just enough signs to assure us that we are not standing before nothingness. This is a profound lesson for a mind-seeking peace. We do not need to see everything to trust that it exists. We do not need complete understanding to feel presence. The universe, in its discretion, practices a different kind of transparency. Transparency through consequences, through influence, through very real changes in the surrounding environment. This indirect observation is also how humans learn to respect boundaries. Rather than forcing entry, we remain outside and listen. Rather than demanding answers, we read the traces that reality is willing to leave behind. There is a quiet beauty in this humility. It allows knowledge to advance without harming itself. In a relaxed state, as the listener lets these images drift through the mind like slow-moving clouds, a sense of trust can form. Trust that even in life, in the universe, and within ourselves, there are parts we cannot look at directly, and yet they still leave footprints. Vague emotions, nameless intuitions, subtle shifts in behavior or rhythm of life. These are all orbits that tell us something is present beneath the surface. Darkness, in this way, is no longer the enemy of understanding. It becomes a silent partner. It does not give us direct images, but it gives us motion, not light, but rhythm. And it is this rhythm that helps us orient ourselves. There is great comfort in realizing that the universe is not completely closed. Even the unseen is not entirely silent. It leaves echoes. And humanity, through patience and sensitivity, learns how to listen to those echoes. As this story drifts toward sleep, it carries a very gentle message. You do not need to illuminate every corner of your mind right now. You do not need to see the depths of every worry or question. Simply recognizing that what truly exists will always leave traces in your life is enough. Feeling those traces is already sufficient. Just as astronomers stand very far away, safely, and still map the darkest regions of the universe, you too can remain here in the present, without falling into the darkness of thought, while understanding that this darkness is not meaningless. It has presence, structure, and influence, and therefore, it does not need to be feared. In the quiet of the night, as breathing grows steady and the mind begins to soften, the idea that darkness can still be traced may become a gentle anchor. It reminds you that you do not need to shine a light on everything to feel safe. Sometimes, simply noticing the footprints, the movements, the faint echoes, is enough to know that you are in a universe that is not blind, but one that speaks in a slower, deeper language than light. Singularity as a philosophical question. When we have learned how to read the footprints of what cannot be seen, When darkness is no longer a blind emptiness, but becomes a region with rhythm, with echoes, the story naturally wishes to take one more step. Not a step toward more advanced instruments or farther observations, but a step inward. Because at a certain point, every journey of exploring the universe leads human beings back to themselves. And at that meeting point, singularity is no longer only a physical phenomenon. It begins to appear as a deeply human question. Science has done its part with honesty. It has gone all the way to the boundary, pointing out where descriptions stop, where light no longer carries information, where equations return silence. Yet, it is precisely this silence that opens another space, the space of reflection. For when answers no longer come from the outside, a question begins to resonate from within. If there are things that cannot be known, then what does knowing mean? Here, singularity is no longer a point to move toward. It is not a destination. It is more like a suspended question mark, one that does not demand resolution. A question that exists not to end the conversation, but to allow the conversation to continue at a deeper level. It reminds us that knowledge is measured not only by the number of answers we possess, but also by our capacity to live alongside unanswered questions. There is a subtle but crucial difference between not knowing because we lack information and not being able to know because reality itself is structured that way. Singularity belongs to the second kind. It does not promise that if we are intelligent enough, persistent enough, or technologically advanced enough, the veil will one day be completely lifted. It stands as a limit of principle, and because of that, it confronts humanity with a choice. Either frustration at the inability to control everything, or maturity through accepting that limit as part of the human condition. At this point, science and philosophy no longer stand on opposite shores. They slow down and walk side by side. Science brings honesty. This is where the model stops. Philosophy brings the next question. So how do we live with that? Science points out the boundary. Philosophy teaches us how to stand at that boundary without trembling. Throughout the history of thought, human beings have been drawn to questions larger than their capacity to answer. Not because such questions promise immediate utility, but because they touch something very deep in the experience of existence. Singularity, in this sense, becomes a symbol of the longing to go beyond oneself. Not to dominate, but to understand one's place within a much larger order. When the listener is in a relaxed state, when breathing has settled and the body has softened, this story can resonate very differently. It does not stimulate the mind through debate. It touches a familiar feeling, the feeling of standing before something far greater than oneself, and realizing that one does not need to possess it in order for life to feel meaningful. At this moment, singularity is no longer the place where science fails. It is the place where science is most honest. And that honesty opens the door to an existential question. If not everything can be known, then what makes life worth living? The answer does not lie in equations, but in how human beings respond to limitation. Some choose to turn away, caring only about what can be measured. Some choose to charge forward, turning limits into challenges to be conquered. But there is also a third path, gentler, deeper, the path of staying with the question, not resolving it, not making it disappear, simply allowing it to exist as part of the inner landscape. In meditation, it is often said that not every thought needs to be followed. Some thoughts only need to be noticed, then allowed to pass. Singularity, as a philosophical question, is the same. It does not need to be pushed away, nor does it need to be grasped tightly. It can remain there like a distant star in the night sky, unreachable, yet sufficient to orient us. Human longing, in the end, is not only a longing to know. It is a longing for meaning. And meaning does not always arise from completion. Sometimes it arises from accepting that some things remain permanently open. Things that never close into a neat answer, yet whose openness keeps the mind from becoming confined. When science and philosophy stand together before singularity, a very beautiful image emerges. Not an image of helplessness, but one of shared humility. Science says, this is the boundary of our models. Philosophy says, and that boundary reveals something essential about the human position, not at the absolute center, not completely outside, but somewhere in between, knowing and not knowing. In the state of preparing for sleep, this realization has a very gentle effect. It allows the listener to release the pressure of having to understand everything about their life right now. There is no need to have answers to every question. No need to have a clear map for every path. Just as the universe continues to function with regions that cannot be known, human beings can live fully with areas of uncertainty in their own experience. Singularity, when seen as a question rather than an answer, becomes a deeply humane reminder that maturity does not lie in filling every gap, but in the ability to remain calm within those gaps. That wisdom is not only the accumulation of knowledge, but also knowing when to stop and listen. And as the story settles into this rhythm, the listener may feel a very gentle shift from the outer universe to inner life. The depths of space reflect the depths of consciousness. The limits of knowledge mirror the limits of personal control. And in that reflection, a sense of companionship arises. We are not alone in not knowing. The universe itself carries things that cannot be known. It is this shared condition that makes the story soothing. Not because it induces sleep in a purely physical sense, but because it releases the tension of the mind. When there is no longer a need to chase the final answer, the mind is allowed to rest. And in that rest, sleep arrives not as an escape, but as a natural return to a state in which we do not need to know, do not need to understand, and yet are still held by a vast, quiet, mysterious reality. Much like singularity itself, silently existing as a question that has never demanded an answer. Humanity before the unknowable. When the question has been set down like a living presence, when singularity is no longer something that needs to be explained, but something to be kept company with, the story naturally turns back toward the listener. Because after all the depths of space, the limits of knowledge, the pauses where science comes to rest, there remains one thing still left to be fully spoken, where human beings themselves stand within this picture. There is a quiet but persistent truth. Humanity has never truly stopped in the face of the unknowable, not because people are certain they will conquer it, but because another force, more subtle, keeps drawing them forward. A force that does not arise from ambition, nor from the need to possess final truth. It comes from curiosity, a deeply human, ancient, and gentle form of movement. Curiosity is not the same as desire. It does not coerce. It does not rush. It does not demand a reward. Curiosity is simply a leaning forward, a very light step toward what is unknown, as if the movement itself were already meaningful. When we look up at the night sky, when we wonder what lies beyond the stars, it is not because we need an immediate answer. We ask because something within us recognizes vastness and wants to touch it in the only way possible, by asking a question. The universe, in its immense silence, becomes a mirror of that very movement. It does not answer everything. It does not explain itself. But neither does it push us away. It allows human beings to approach the boundary, to touch the unknowable, and then leaves them to decide what to do with that contact. There is a very particular moment when we realize that humans do not search because they are certain they will find. They search because the act of searching itself makes them feel alive. In this sense, a question is not a road to an answer. It is a way of locating oneself within the universe, a way of saying, I am here and I recognize that there is something far greater than me. As the listener lies still, as breathing slows and becomes steady, this idea may touch a very deep layer of personal experience. Because in every life, there are questions without answers, crossroads without clear direction, feelings that cannot be named. And yet, we continue to live, to move forward, to ask, not to close these questions, but to keep the connection between ourselves and the world from breaking. Human beings, in the end, are not creatures of answers. They are creatures of questions. From children asking why, to scientists questioning the origin of time, to people lying awake at night wondering about the meaning of their own lives. All of them participate in the same movement. A movement without a clear destination, but with a direction toward deeper understanding, even if that understanding is never complete. Seen from a distance, this is clearly reflected in the way humanity approaches the universe. Even knowing there are regions that cannot be entered, even knowing there are questions that cannot be answered, people continue to observe, to measure, to reflect. Not because they expect darkness to disappear entirely one day, but because standing before darkness without turning away is already a powerful statement about what it means to be human. In a meditative space, this reflection becomes especially clear. The listener is no longer merely receiving the story. They become part of it. The same curiosity that led astronomers to look up at the sky is the curiosity quietly present in the listener's mind right now. The curiosity that keeps them listening, that prevents them from turning away, that allows them to sink deeper into slow, unfolding thought. And here, something deeply liberating appears. If human beings do not exist to possess all the answers, then not having answers to one's own life right now is no longer a failure. It is a natural part of being human. Just as the universe does not need to explain its entire structure in order to exist, human beings do not need to fully understand themselves in order to live fully. There is a quiet beauty in accepting that we move forward, not because we know where the path leads, but because something within us does not allow us to stop. Not out of fear of emptiness, but from the sense that movement toward the unknown keeps consciousness open, breathing, alive. At this rhythm, the universe ceases to be merely an object of study. It becomes a vast setting in which human curiosity is reflected and magnified. Galaxies rotating around invisible centers mirror the way humans circle questions without final answers. Inaccessible regions of space reflect the parts of inner life we are not yet ready to understand. And within this reflection, a feeling of companionship arises. The listener no longer feels like a small, isolated individual facing a cold universe. They become part of a larger movement, the movement of awareness, curiosity, and the continual turning toward the unknown without the need to possess it. In the state of preparing for sleep, this brings a very deep comfort. Because sleep itself, in a way, is also an entry into the unknowable. We do not control it. We do not track it. We can only allow ourselves to drift into it. And the fact that we do this every night without fear reveals that human beings are far more familiar with living alongside the unknown than they often realize. Humanity does not stop before what it cannot know, not because it disregards limits, but because it has learned how to live with them. Questions are asked not to end the story, but to keep the story alive. And because of this, questions become places of refuge rather than threats. As the listener lies still and allows these ideas to settle, a very gentle realization may arise. That the act of listening, of being curious, of allowing oneself to move with this story, is already a clear expression of what it means to be human. You do not need to understand the universe in order to belong to it. You do not need answers in order to have meaning. The simple act of asking and staying with the question in calmness is already a deep harmony with the very structure of the universe. From this, a new sense of ease forms. Not ease because everything has been explained, but ease because nothing needs to be explained in order for you to rest. Just as the universe continues to exist with regions that cannot be known, you too can continue to exist, to live, to breathe, to sleep, together with your questions. Not as burdens, but as quiet, faithful companions on the path of being human within a vast, deep universe that has never required you to know everything. Closing into stillness. When the movement of curiosity has completed its arc, when the question has been carried far enough that it no longer asks to be answered, something very natural occurs. Not an ending in the sense of closure, but a settling. Like a wave that, after a long journey, finally reaches the shore and dissolves. Not disappearing, only changing form. In that moment, human beings are no longer standing opposite the universe, no longer reflecting or comparing. They begin to merge. Now, there is nothing more that needs to be understood. Every concept has completed its role. Every image has been held long enough to become familiar. The depths, the limits, the great questions, all of them can be set down gently, like something carried all day and finally taken off the shoulders. Not because they no longer matter, but because they no longer need to be held tightly. At this point, the narration no longer leads the mind anywhere. It returns to the simplest thing, the thing that has always been here, yet so often overlooked: presence. Not presence as effort, not as focus or control, but presence as permission. Permission to be here, in this moment, with this body, with this breath. You may notice that your breathing has slowed, not because anyone asked it to, but because it has found its natural pace again. The inhale does not need to be deep. The exhale does not need to be long. They only need to be left alone. And when they are left alone, they arrange themselves naturally, just as everything in the universe tends toward the state of least tension. In this state, understanding or not understanding no longer makes a difference. The universe does not require you to grasp its structure in order to rest within it, just as you do not need to understand sleep in order to fall asleep. You only need to allow, and that allowance does not require words or decisions. It can be very simple, very quiet. Feel the weight of your body being supported. The bed, the chair, the space around you. Everything is doing its work without your involvement. You do not have to hold yourself there. You are being held. And if that sense of being held is noticed, it can bring a very deep peace. Now, the story of the universe is no longer a story out there. It has completed its journey by returning to what is closest: the breath, the heartbeat, the faint warmth within the body. These things do not need to be analyzed. They do not need to be questioned. They only need to be allowed, or not even clearly felt, just not resisted. There is something quietly beautiful here. After traveling through the deepest regions of space and time, after touching the limits of knowledge and longing, we return to the simplest thing, not as a retreat, but as a completion, as if the entire journey existed only to remind us that at the far end of every great question, what remains is this very ordinary act of being. And this being does not need to be supported by grand meaning. It is sufficient on its own, like a star that does not need to know it is shining in order to shine, like the universe that does not need to explain itself in order to continue unfolding. You are the same. You do not need to understand who you are in the larger picture in order to be allowed to rest. In this moment, you may release even the idea that you are listening to something. The narration can slowly become background sound and then dissolve into silence. There is no need to follow every sentence. No need to remember. If a thought appears, you do not need to push it away, nor do you need to follow it. Let it pass, like light from a distant star crossing the night sky, without disturbing the stillness. Sleep is not a place to arrive at. It is a state to fall into, and falling does not require effort. On the contrary, it happens when effort stops. When you stop trying to understand, stop trying to keep up, stop trying to do things correctly. When you are simply here, in the simplicity of breathing. You may not notice the moment you fall asleep. That is perfectly fine. You do not need to witness it. Sleep does not need a witness. It arrives when conditions are sufficient, and the only condition needed now is release. Release the idea that you need to stay awake. Release the idea that you need to listen until the end. Release even the idea that you are doing something. There is no task to complete, no understanding to achieve, no destination to reach. There is only the breath coming and going, only the body growing heavier, only the silence expanding, not as a frightening emptiness, but as a space large enough for you to dissolve into. In that silence, you are not lost. You are integrated, like a drop of water returning to the ocean, not disappearing, only no longer needing to be a separate drop. Like consciousness easing into sleep, not shutting down, only shifting into another form of presence, softer, deeper. If there is anything to carry from this entire journey, it is not a concept, but a very gentle feeling, the feeling that you are allowed to rest. No reason required, no condition needed, no understanding necessary. And as that feeling spreads, slowly, softly, you can let it do the rest. There is nothing to follow, nothing to hold on to. Simply remain in this moment, allowing the breath to carry you the final distance. Not toward an answer, but toward deep, peaceful sleep, where all questions are set down, and existence itself is already enough.